The knock came sharp and urgent, 3 times, as if the man outside knew Eleanor Ashcombe was standing only a few feet away with wet paint still on her fingers. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door before she could think better of it, and the moment she saw what the stranger carried, her breath caught in her throat and would not come loose. He held a canvas wrapped loosely in brown cloth, but one corner had slipped free, and she could see a fragment of a painted collar, a jawline, a familiar curve of a familiar mouth. She knew that brushwork. She had made it with her own hand, 6 years ago, in a small studio that no longer existed. It was the portrait of Duke Alaric Hawthorne, the man she had been told burned to death in a fire at his family estate. "Forgive me for calling so late," the stranger said. He was young, perhaps 30, with tired eyes and traveling dust still clinging to his coat. "My name is Nathaniel Cole. I was told you painted this." Eleanor did not answer right away. She stared at the fragment of canvas as though it might vanish if she looked away. As though the whole encounter were a trick her grief had finally decided to play on her. She had mourned Alaric for 6 years. She had built a smaller, quieter life around that morning, moved to this coastal town, changed the way she signed her paintings, tried to become someone the past could not easily find. "Where did you get that?" she finally said, her voice thinner than she intended. "A locked room," Nathaniel answered. "In a townhouse in London that belonged to the Hawthorne family. I work for the solicitors handling the estate's sale. We were told the house had stood empty since the Duke's death, but the room had been used. Recently, I think." Eleanor's hand found the doorframe and gripped it. "That cannot be. The Duke died in the fire at Ashcombe Hall, 6 years past. I read the notice myself." "I read it too," Nathaniel said quietly, "and yet the portrait was not damaged by any fire. There is no soot on it, no scorch, no smell of smoke. Whoever kept it in that room protected it very carefully." She wanted to close the door. She wanted, quite badly, to tell this stranger that he had the wrong woman, the wrong painting, the wrong life entirely, and to send him back into the night so she could return to the version of grief she had learned, painfully, to live inside. But her eyes kept returning to that sliver of painted collar, and something old and stubborn in her chest refused to let the door swing shut. "Come in," she said instead, surprising herself. Her cottage was small but tidy, with canvases stacked along one wall and the smell of linseed oil hanging faintly in the air. She lit a second lamp and gestured for Nathaniel to set the painting on the table. When he finally unwrapped it fully, Eleanor had to press a hand to her mouth. It was him, exactly as she remembered him, exactly as she had painted him the week before the fire, when he had sat for her in the golden afternoon light of his study, laughing at something she'd said, telling her that no other artist in England could capture the particular stubbornness of his own eyebrows. She remembered the way he had reached for her hand when the session ended, the promise he had made her, the plans neither of them had been permitted to keep. "I painted this for him," she whispered. "It was meant to hang in his private study. No one else was ever supposed to see it." "Someone did," Nathaniel said. "Someone kept it hidden for 6 years." Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs unwilling to hold her any longer. "The fire took the north wing of Ashcombe Hall. I was told his body could not be recovered, that the flames were too fierce. His cousin, Lord Reginald, inherited the title within the month. I attended no funeral, because there was nothing left to bury." "There may have been nothing left to bury," Nathaniel said carefully, "because there was nothing to bury in the first place." The words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Eleanor thought she understood about the last 6 years of her life. She looked at him properly now, taking in the ink stains on his fingers, the careful way he had wrapped the painting before carrying it across half the country to find her. "Why come to me?" she asked. "Why not go to the family, or the authorities?" Nathaniel hesitated. "Because I do not yet know who I can trust with what I found." The room where this painting was kept also held ledgers, correspondence, and other things that suggest someone has been managing the Hawthorne estate very carefully, very quietly, for a long time after the Duke's supposed death. "I am only a clerk, Miss Ashcombe. I catalogue documents. I am not equipped to accuse a lord of anything. But I could not simply leave this painting in that room and pretend I had not seen it. I recognized the artist's mark in the corner. It took me 2 weeks to find you." Eleanor looked down at her own hands, the same hands that had mixed the paint for Alaric's eyes, a color she had never quite managed to replicate since. She thought of the years she had spent believing him gone, the nights she had allowed herself to cry only in private because grief for a man so far above her station was not something polite society permitted her to display too openly. "If he is alive," she said slowly, testing the words as though they might break in her mouth, "then someone has spent 6 years making certain the world believed otherwise. And whoever did that would not welcome two people arriving to undo their work. No, Nathaniel agreed, they would not. A gust of wind rattled the window, and Eleanor rose to check the latch, more from restlessness than any real concern. Outside, the street was empty, lit only by a single lamp swaying gently on its post. But as she stood there, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. A carriage stood at the far end of the lane, its horses still, its curtains drawn, though no one seemed to be entering or leaving any house nearby. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly. "Did anyone follow you here?" He came to stand beside her, and his expression shifted the moment he saw the carriage. "I do not know, I was careful. But I also was not the only person interested in that locked room." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Nathaniel said, "that 2 days before I found the painting, one of the older clerks in our office was dismissed without explanation, after he asked too many questions about why the Hawthorne accounts never fully balanced. I do not think it was a coincidence." Eleanor stepped back from the window, pulling the curtain closed with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. She thought of Reginald Hawthorne, a man she had met only twice, both times at a careful distance, both times aware of his cool, assessing eyes upon her, as though he were calculating precisely how much of a problem she might one day become. "There is a solicitor," she said, "a Mr. Pemberton, who handled the Hawthorne affairs when I knew Alaric. If anyone kept records of what truly happened after the fire, it would be him." "Then we should speak with him," Nathaniel said, "before whoever is watching that house decides to remove anything else that might tell the truth." Eleanor looked once more at the portrait resting on her table, at the face she had loved and mourned, and had never quite managed to release. 6 years of careful, quiet grief now felt like something built on sand, and she was not certain whether the ground shifting beneath her was terror, or the first fragile stirrings of hope. "I will come with you to London," she said, "but I want you to understand something first. If Alaric is alive, and if he has been hidden away by his own family for 6 years, then whoever did this to him will not simply let us walk in and ask polite questions. We will need to be very careful, Mr. Cole." "I intend to be," Nathaniel said. "I only hope it is careful enough." Nathaniel stayed only long enough to arrange the details of their journey, insisting they leave before dawn, before the town fully woke and any watching eyes could count the hours of his visit. When he finally stepped back out into the night, Eleanor bolted the door behind him and stood alone in her small studio, surrounded by half-finished paintings of strangers who had paid her modest sums for portraits far less complicated than the one now sitting on her table. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat across from the painting until the candle burned low, studying every stroke as though it might tell her something new, something she had missed the first time she painted it. She remembered how nervous she had been that final afternoon, how Alaric had teased her gently about the seriousness on her face while she worked, how he had promised, half joking and half not, that one day the whole world would know the painting had been made by her hand, and not some fashionable London artist paid to flatter a lord's vanity. That promise had never been kept. Within a fortnight of finishing it, the fire had taken the north wing of Ashcombe Hall, and every plan they had quietly built together had gone up with it, or so she had believed for 6 long years. She thought too of the letters she had written him in secret during their courtship, delivered by a maid who had since married and moved away, and of the final letter she never sent, the one in which she had asked him plainly whether his family's disapproval would ever soften enough to let them be together honestly. She had burned that letter herself, the night before his supposed death reached her ears, certain she would never need it again. Now she wondered whether Reginald Hawthorne had known of her feelings for his cousin all along, and whether that knowledge had shaped some part of whatever had truly happened in that fire. It was not a comfortable thought, and it kept her wide awake long after the candle had gone out, her eyes fixed on the shadowed outline of the portrait until the first gray light of morning finally crept beneath the curtain. When Nathaniel returned as promised, just as the sky was turning pale, Eleanor had already packed a small bag and wrapped the portrait carefully back in its cloth. She did not know what waited for them in London, whether they would find answers or only more carefully guarded silence, but she knew she could not spend one more day pretending the last 6 years had told her the whole truth. "Are you certain," Nathaniel asked, watching her lock the cottage door behind her, "that you wish to do this? Once we begin asking questions in London, there may be no quiet way to stop." Eleanor looked past him, toward the road that led away from the small, careful life she had built for herself, the one stitched together entirely out of grief she now suspected had been built on a lie. "I stopped wanting quiet the moment you knocked on my door," she said. "Whatever is waiting for us, Mr. Cole, I would rather know it than spend another 6 years mourning a man who may still be alive. The carriage he had hired stood waiting at the end of the lane, its horses stamping impatiently in the cold morning air. Eleanor climbed inside without looking back at the cottage, the portrait held carefully across her lap, and as the wheels began to turn toward London, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 6 long years. Not certainty, not yet, but the first fragile edge of hope, sharp enough to cut and strong enough to carry her forward into whatever truth was waiting for her at the end of the road. The carriage jolted hard against a rut in the road, and Eleanor's hand shot out to steady the wrapped portrait before it could slide from her lap, her heart hammering as though the sudden jolt had been an attack rather than an ordinary hazard of travel. 2 days on the road toward London had turned her nerves raw, every sound outside the carriage window now a possible threat rather than the harmless noise it likely was. "We are close," Nathaniel said, glancing out at the passing hedgerows. "Another hour, perhaps less." Eleanor nodded, though her mind had drifted again to the last time she had traveled this same road, 6 years earlier, filled with a very different kind of nervous energy. She had been on her way to deliver the finished portrait to Ashcombe Hall, rehearsing in her head exactly what she would say when she placed it in Alaric's hands. She had not known then that it would be the last time she ever saw him, or believed she had. Their courtship had begun almost by accident. Alaric had commissioned her for a smaller piece, a study of his mother, after seeing one of Eleanor's paintings displayed modestly in a shop window in town. He had been kind in a way she had not expected from a man of his rank, patient with her nervousness, genuinely curious about her craft rather than merely tolerant of it. Over the months of sittings that followed, kindness had slowly become something else entirely, something neither of them had planned for, and both of them had tried, and failed, to resist. His family had never approved. His mother had been coldly polite to Eleanor's face, and openly dismissive behind closed doors, and his cousin Reginald had made no effort to hide his disdain for what he called an unsuitable attachment. Alaric had promised her, again and again, that none of it mattered, that he intended to make his own choices regardless of what his family wished. She had believed him completely. She had built a future in her mind around that belief, only to watch it burn away with the rest of Ashcombe Hall's north wing. "You have gone quiet," Nathaniel observed. "I was remembering," Eleanor said simply. "It is difficult not to, on this road." He did not press her further, and she was grateful for it. Instead, he occupied himself reviewing a small notebook he had carried since leaving her cottage, filled with careful notes about the townhouse, the estate accounts, and the dismissed clerk whose sudden disappearance from the solicitor's office still troubled him. When they finally reached London, the city's noise and crowding felt like an assault after the quiet of the coast, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the anonymity it offered, even as she remained watchful of every face that lingered a moment too long in their direction. Nathaniel led her through a maze of narrow streets until they arrived at a tall, narrow townhouse with shuttered windows and a faintly neglected air, the kind of building that announced its emptiness to anyone who cared to look closely. "This is it," he said, producing a key from his coat. "The solicitors hold the keys until the sale is finalized. No one is meant to be inside." The house was cold and dim. Dust settled thick over furniture draped in white cloth, the air carrying the particular stillness of rooms long undisturbed. Eleanor followed Nathaniel up 2 flights of narrow stairs to a small room at the back of the house, its door fitted with a lock far sturdier than anything else she had seen in the building. Inside, the room told a very different story from the rest of the house. There was no dust here. A writing desk sat near the window, its surface bare but clearly used, and a small cot stood against one wall, blankets folded with a precision that suggested habit rather than neglect. Eleanor's chest tightened as she took it in. "Someone has been living here," she said quietly. "Or hiding here," Nathaniel replied. "I found the ledgers in that desk, and this." He crossed to the cot and lifted the corner of a folded blanket, revealing a woman's glove tucked carefully beneath it, pale gray leather, finely stitched, entirely unlike anything Eleanor herself owned. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, searching for any mark or initial that might identify its owner, but found none. "It is not mine," she said, answering the question she could see forming on Nathaniel's face. "I have never seen it before." "Then, someone else has been here too," he said. "Recently, from the look of it." Eleanor set the glove down carefully and moved instead to the writing desk, where a stack of letters sat bound loosely with string. She untied them with careful fingers, aware of Nathaniel watching over her shoulder, and began to read. Most were mundane, correspondence about household accounts and shipments of goods, nothing that explained the mystery of the locked room. But near the bottom of the stack, one letter made her breath stop entirely. It was addressed to Alaric Hawthorne, dated more than a year after the fire that was supposed to have killed him. She read it twice before she trusted herself to speak. This letter was written to him, a full year after his death was recorded. Someone was writing to him as though he were still alive, still receiving correspondence, still expected to reply. Nathaniel took the letter from her hands and read it himself, his expression darkening with each line. It speaks of an arrangement, payments made on a regular schedule, in exchange for what the writer calls his cooperation and his continued silence. It is unsigned. Silence about what? It does not say directly, but whoever wrote this clearly believed Alaric was alive to receive it, and clearly believed he had reason to stay quiet about something. Nathaniel set the letter down carefully, as though it might crumble beneath rough handling. This is not proof he is alive today, but it is proof he did not die in that fire. Eleanor pressed a hand against the writing desk to steady herself, the room suddenly feeling smaller and colder than it had a moment before. 6 years of grief, 6 years of carefully managed sorrow, all of it now standing on ground that had never been solid to begin with. "We need to find out who has been paying for his silence," she said, "and where he has been kept all this time." "I agree, but we should be careful how we ask." Nathaniel moved to the window and glanced down at the street below, his shoulders tense. "There is a carriage across the road. It has not moved since we arrived." Eleanor joined him at the window, and her stomach dropped at the sight of the same dark, curtained carriage she had seen outside her own cottage 2 nights before, or one identical enough to send a fresh wave of alarm through her chest. "That cannot be a coincidence," she said. "No," Nathaniel agreed grimly, "it cannot." They gathered the letters in the glove quickly, tucking them into Nathaniel's satchel alongside his notebook, and made their way back down through the silent house with far more urgency than they had climbed it. Outside, the afternoon light had turned gray and heavy with the promise of rain, and the carriage across the street remained exactly where it had been, its curtains drawn, giving no sign of the person watching from within. "We should go directly to Mr. Pemberton," Eleanor said as they hurried along the pavement, careful not to look back too often toward the carriage. "If anyone in London knows the truth about what happened to Alaric, it will be him. He handled every part of the Hawthorne estate before the fire." "And if he is the one who has been arranging these payments?" Nathaniel asked. Eleanor slowed her steps, the question landing with uncomfortable weight. She had known Mr. Pemberton only briefly, through Alaric, and had always found him courteous but guarded, a man who chose his words with the same precision he likely applied to every contract he drafted. She did not want to believe he could be capable of deceiving her so completely, of standing quietly by while she mourned a man he knew to be alive. But 6 years of easy assumptions had already proven dangerously wrong once. "Then we will know it the moment we ask him," she said finally. "I would rather see his face when I mention that letter than continue guessing in the dark." They found a hired cab a few streets away, and as it pulled into the flow of traffic, Eleanor allowed herself one glance backward. The dark carriage had begun to move as well, keeping a careful, deliberate distance behind them, and she understood, with a cold certainty settling low in her stomach, that whoever wished to keep Alaric's survival a secret already knew exactly who was asking questions, and had no intention of letting them ask many more. Mr. Pemberton's offices occupied the ground floor of a narrow building near the Inns of Court, its brass plate polished to a shine that suggested a business proud of its own respectability. A young clerk showed them into a waiting room lined with law books, and Eleanor spent the minutes before Pemberton appeared studying the framed certificates on his wall, trying to steady her breathing and prepare herself for whatever his face might reveal. When he finally entered, his expression shifted through several things at once: surprise, recognition, and something else that vanished too quickly for Eleanor to name it before he mastered his features into practiced calm. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "it has been a great many years." "It has," she agreed. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Pemberton, but I have come with questions I believe only you can answer." He gestured for them to sit, and Eleanor noticed, as she lowered herself into the offered chair, that his hands were not quite steady as he settled behind his desk. Nathaniel introduced himself briefly, mentioning the solicitor's office where he was employed, and Pemberton's guarded expression sharpened further at the connection. "I understand you have been cataloging the Hawthorne townhouse," Pemberton said carefully, addressing Nathaniel. "A tedious business, I should think, for a man of your position." "Tedious, yes," Nathaniel replied, "until I found a room that did not match the rest of the house." Silence settled over the office, thick enough that Eleanor could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere behind Pemberton's desk. She reached into the satchel and drew out the letter they had found, setting it gently on the desk between them, watching his eyes as they moved across the page. "This letter is addressed to Alaric," she said. dated a full year after his death was recorded. I would like to know how that is possible, Mr. Pemberton, and I would like to know whether you have known the truth of his death this entire time. Pemberton's composure did not shatter all at once. It cracked slowly, in the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed flat against the desk as though bracing himself against a blow he had long expected but never quite prepared for. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "I did not draft that letter," he said, "and I want you to believe that, because it is true. But I will not insult you by claiming ignorance of everything else. I have known, for some years now, that the fire at Ashcombe Hall did not take the life it was reported to have taken." Eleanor's hands curled tightly in her lap, her nails pressing crescents into her palms. "Then he is alive." "He was alive. The last certain word I received," Pemberton said, "though I confess I do not know his current condition, nor his exact location. I was told only enough to keep the estate's affairs in order, and warned, quite plainly, that asking further questions would not be welcomed." "Warned by whom?" Nathaniel pressed. Pemberton hesitated, glancing toward the door as though he expected someone might be listening on the other side of it. "Lord Reginald Hawthorne inherited the title and the estate within a month of the fire. He has managed every part of the family's affairs since, including, I now suspect, whatever arrangement has kept his cousin hidden and silent for 6 years. I was a young solicitor when I took on the Hawthorne family as clients, Miss Ashcombe. I did not ask enough questions when I should have, and by the time I understood the shape of what I had become part of, I found myself with very little room left to object." "You let me believe he was dead," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now with an anger she had not expected to feel toward this careful, guarded man. "I mourned him. I built an entire life out of that mourning." "I know," Pemberton said quietly, "and I am not proud of my silence. But understand, Miss Ashcombe, that Reginald Hawthorne is not a man who tolerates loose ends easily. The clerk who asked too many questions about the estate accounts was dismissed within a week of raising them. I have often wondered whether dismissal was the gentlest outcome available to him." Nathaniel leaned forward. "Then you believe we are in danger?" "I believe," Pemberton said carefully, "that you have already been noticed, or you would not have come to me with that letter in hand. I would advise both of you to move very carefully from this point forward, and to trust very few people with what you now know." Eleanor rose from her chair, her thoughts already racing ahead toward the next question that needed answering. Where would he keep him? If Alaric has been alive and hidden for 6 years, he cannot have been kept in that room in the townhouse the entire time. It showed signs of recent use, but not years of it. "I do not know the location," Pemberton admitted. "That knowledge was kept from me deliberately, I believe, precisely so that I could not reveal it under pressure or conscience. But there was a woman, once employed in the Hawthorne household as a lady's maid, who left her position rather suddenly around the time of the fire, and who has since lived comfortably on an income no one has ever fully explained. Her name is Margaret O'Say. If anyone beyond Reginald himself knows where Alaric has been kept, I would begin my search with her." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, the glove they had found in the locked room suddenly taking on new significance in her mind. "Do you know where she lives now?" "I do not," Pemberton said, "but I imagine your Mr. Cole, given his talent for finding locked rooms and old letters, will manage to discover it before long." A faint, weary smile crossed his face, the first genuine expression Eleanor had seen from him since he entered the room. "I am sorry, Miss Ashcombe. Truly. I should have found the courage to tell you the truth years ago, whatever the cost to myself." "Then help us find him now," Eleanor said. "That would be a beginning, at least." Pemberton nodded slowly, and for the first time since their arrival, something like resolve settled over his tired features. "Yes, I believe it would be." Glass shattered somewhere below the window, and Eleanor was on her feet before she understood why, her heart slamming against her ribs as Nathaniel pulled her sharply back from the light. They had taken rooms above a quiet bakery 2 streets from Pemberton's office, meaning to rest only a few hours before continuing their search, but the sound below told her rest would have to wait. "Stay back from the window," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the door with more calm than Eleanor felt capable of at that moment. He returned a few minutes later, his face pale but his voice steady. "A cart overturned in the street, nothing more. But I do not think either of us will sleep easily tonight." Eleanor sat back down slowly, her hands still trembling from the sudden fright, embarrassed at how quickly her nerves had frayed and grateful, at the same time, that they had. 6 years of quiet grief had made her soft in ways she was only now beginning to notice, and she suspected the coming days would demand a great deal more steadiness than she currently possessed. "We should not stay in one place too long," she said. Not after that carriage followed us from the townhouse. Agreed. Tomorrow we find Margaret O'Say. Nathaniel settled into the chair across from her, pulling his notebook from his coat and flipping to a fresh page. I made inquiries while you spoke with Pemberton's clerk. A woman by that name receives a quarterly payment from an account connected to the Hawthorne estate, delivered through a bank on Cheapside. If she still lives in London, the bank's records may tell us where. You learned all that in the space of an hour? I learned it, Nathaniel said, allowing a small, tired smile, because clerks talk to other clerks far more freely than lords talk to solicitors. It is a useful thing to be underestimated, Miss Ashcombe. People forget to guard their words around a man who spends his days copying documents. Eleanor studied him for a moment, this careful, quietly resourceful man who had appeared at her door only days earlier, and had since upended everything she believed about the last 6 years of her life. She realized she knew almost nothing about him beyond his occupation and his evident talent for uncovering secrets. Why did you truly come to find me, Mr. Cole? You could have brought the painting to the authorities, or simply left it where you found it and said nothing at all. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, turning his pen slowly between his fingers. My father was a clerk too, for a family not unlike the Hawthorns. He discovered something he should not have, a discrepancy in the accounts that suggested his employer was defrauding a business partner. He reported it, quietly, through the proper channels, trusting the system to correct itself. He paused. He lost his position within the month, and no one in our profession would hire him afterward. He died believing that honesty had cost him everything, and that silence would have served him better. And you disagree. I have spent every year since trying to disagree, Nathaniel said. But I have also learned to be careful about how I go about it. I did not want to hand that painting to a magistrate who might quietly lose it, or to a newspaper that might print half a story and get the rest wrong. I wanted to find the person who would understand exactly what it meant. That was you. Eleanor felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a small measure of trust settling into place where wariness had been. Then let us be careful together, Mr. Cole. I find I have very little patience left for losing people to silence. They left before dawn the next morning, making their way through streets still hushed with early mist toward the bank on Cheapside. Nathaniel's contact there, a junior clerk who owed him a favor from some previous kindness, provided an address with visible reluctance, glancing repeatedly toward the office door, as though fearing discovery even in the act of helping. The address led them to a respectable but unremarkable house on a quiet street, the sort of home that spoke of comfortable income without any excess that might draw attention. Eleanor's pulse quickened as they approached the door, uncertain what kind of woman would answer, and uncertain, too, what kind of loyalty 6 years of quiet payment might have purchased. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, with sharp, watchful eyes that moved immediately from Eleanor's face to the satchel Nathaniel carried, as though she had learned long ago to read danger in small details. Margaret O'Say? Eleanor asked. The woman's expression tightened. Who is asking? My name is Eleanor Ashcombe. I believe you once served the Hawthorne family, as I once painted for them. Eleanor held her ground despite the woman's obvious wariness. I found a portrait I painted for Alaric Hawthorne in a locked room of his family's townhouse. Alongside it, I found a glove I believe may belong to you. Something flickered across Margaret's face. Fear and recognition tangled together too quickly to separate. For a long moment, Eleanor thought she would simply close the door. Then, with visible reluctance, Margaret stepped back and gestured them inside. You should not have come here, she said, once the door was shut firmly behind them. If anyone saw you approach my house, we are all in a great deal more danger than you understand. Then help us understand it, Nathaniel said. Please. We do not wish to bring harm to you, Miss O'Say. We wish only to learn the truth. Margaret led them into a small sitting room, drawing the curtains tighter before she finally settled into a chair across from them, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. I was in service to the Hawthorne family for 11 years. I cared for the Duke's mother in her final illness, and I was fond of the young Duke himself, fond enough that when I learned what his cousin intended to do to him, I could not simply walk away and pretend I had heard nothing. What did you hear? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard Lord Reginald speaking with a man I did not recognize 2 nights before the fire that supposedly killed the Duke. They spoke of an arrangement, of a room prepared somewhere far from London, of payments that would continue only so long as certain conditions were met. Margaret's voice wavered, but she pressed on. I did not understand the full shape of it until after the fire, when I realized the Duke's body was never truly recovered, only assumed lost among the ashes. By then it was too late for me to say anything without risking my own safety. and perhaps his as well. He is alive then, Eleanor said, needing to hear the words spoken plainly, despite already suspecting their truth. He was alive, Margaret said. Injured, badly, from what little I overheard, burned in the fire itself, though not killed by it, and kept somewhere quiet afterward, somewhere his recovery could be managed without questions being asked. I do not believe Reginald intended to kill his cousin outright. I believe he intended something crueler, to remove him from his own life entirely, while keeping him alive enough to control. Why? Nathaniel asked. What did Reginald gain by keeping him alive, rather than simply letting the world believe he had died in truth? Margaret's mouth twisted into something bitter. A body missing is one thing. A body that might one day be found, and identified, and questioned, is quite another. I believe Reginald feared what might happen if the Duke's death were too closely examined and found wanting. Better, in his calculation, to remove his cousin quietly, keep him controlled and silent somewhere far away, and let time do the rest of the work in erasing him from memory. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, the full cruelty of it settling over her slowly. 6 years of the man she loved being kept alive, injured, hidden, controlled, while she and everyone who had ever cared for him mourned a death that had never actually occurred. Where, she said, when she trusted her voice again, where would he keep him? I do not know precisely, Margaret admitted. But I overheard mention, once, of a property on the Yorkshire moors, an almshouse that had fallen into disuse decades ago, and was quietly purchased under a false name shortly before the fire. I believed at the time it was simply an investment. I understand now it was likely prepared as a place to keep the Duke hidden, far from anyone who might recognize him. Nathaniel was already writing in his notebook, his hand moving quickly across the page. Do you recall any further detail, anything at all that might help us locate the property? Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the window as though the very act of remembering might summon danger to her door. Only that it was near a village called Ashworth Fell, though I could not tell you the exact road. I am sorry. I have spent 6 years trying very hard not to remember any of it too clearly. You have given us more than you know, Eleanor said gently. Thank you, Miss O'Shea. Truly. Margaret's composure cracked slightly at the gratitude, her carefully guarded expression softening into something closer to grief. I have taken his money for 6 years, Miss Ashcombe, and told myself it was payment for services rendered rather than payment for silence. I am not proud of the distinction I drew to make that bearable. If you find him, tell him I am sorry. Tell him I should have found the courage sooner. As they rose to leave, Margaret caught Eleanor's arm at the door, her grip surprisingly firm. Be careful traveling north. Reginald has men who watch for anyone asking questions he does not wish answered, and Yorkshire is far enough from London that help may not arrive quickly if you need it. Eleanor nodded, the weight of the warning settling heavily alongside the fragile hope now growing in her chest. Outside, the London afternoon had turned gray and heavy again, the same threatening weather that seemed to have followed them since their arrival, and as they made their way back toward their rooms above the bakery, Eleanor felt, for the first time since Nathaniel had appeared at her door, something closer to purpose than fear. Ashworth Fell, she said quietly, testing the name as though it were a promise. Then that is where we go next. It will not be a simple journey, Nathaniel warned. If Reginald's men are watching the roads north, we will need to move carefully, and perhaps not by the most direct route. I have spent 6 years believing him lost to me, Eleanor said. I do not intend to lose him again to caution, Mr. Cole. We will be careful, but we will go. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his tired features. Then we will go together, and we will be careful together. That much I can promise you. Behind them, unnoticed in the gathering dusk, a figure lingered at the corner of the street, watching the direction they had taken with quiet, patient attention, before turning away to deliver a report that would reach Reginald Hawthorne before the night was through. That night, back in their rooms above the bakery, Eleanor could not settle. She sat by the small window with a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, watching the street below for any sign of the dark carriage or the watchful figure Margaret's warning had made her newly alert to. Nathaniel worked at the small table behind her, cross-referencing the notes from his notebook against a map of Yorkshire he had purchased earlier that day, tracing possible routes toward Ashworth Fell with the tip of his pen. You should rest, he said, without looking up. Tomorrow will demand a great deal of us. I cannot, Eleanor admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see that room in the townhouse, the cot with its blankets folded so carefully, and I think of him lying somewhere similar for 6 years, believing himself abandoned by everyone who claimed to love him. Her voice caught. What if he believes I stopped searching, Mr. Cole? What if he believes I simply moved on and forgot him? Nathaniel set down his pen and turned to face her fully. You could not have searched for a death you had no reason to doubt. No one could fault you for that, least of all a man who loved you enough to keep your portrait hidden through 6 years of captivity, rather than letting it be destroyed or forgotten. You believe he kept it himself then, not Reginald, and not whoever guarded him. I think a man capable of arranging false letters and quarterly payments would have little use for a portrait painted by the woman his prisoner still loved, Nathaniel said. I think Alaric asked for it, or hid it himself when it was brought to him, and that whoever guarded that room allowed it, because it cost them nothing and kept their prisoner cooperative. He paused. That is only a guess, Miss Ashcombe, but it is the guess that makes the most sense to me. Eleanor turned back to the window, comforted slightly by the thought even as it deepened her grief for all the years already lost. 6 years, she said quietly. 6 years of believing himself forgotten, injured, controlled by the very family that should have protected him. I do not know if I can forgive Reginald for that, even once justice has been done. I would not ask you to, Nathaniel said. Some things do not require forgiveness to be resolved. They only require truth and consequence. They lapsed into silence after that, Eleanor watching the street while Nathaniel returned to his maps, and eventually exhaustion overtook her nerves enough that she slept, fitfully, in the chair by the window, waking twice to check the street below before dawn finally softened the darkness into gray. They left London before the city fully woke, taking a longer, less direct route north, that Nathaniel insisted upon despite the additional hours it would cost them. He had arranged for a private carriage rather than the mail coach, paying extra for a driver he trusted through a connection from his father's old circle of acquaintances, a quiet, weathered man named Edmund who asked no questions and kept his eyes constantly moving across the passing landscape. The journey north unfolded slowly across 2 full days, the roads growing narrower and the countryside wilder as they left the crowded comfort of southern England behind. Eleanor found herself grateful for the enforced stillness of travel, hours in which she could turn over everything they had learned and try to prepare herself for what waited at the end of the road, though no amount of preparation felt sufficient for the possibility of finally seeing Alaric again after 6 years of believing him lost. On the second evening, as the carriage stopped to change horses at a coaching inn, Nathaniel drew her aside with an urgency that immediately renewed her earlier fear. Edmund noticed a rider following us for the better part of the afternoon, he said quietly, glancing toward the stable yard where their driver stood in low conversation with the innkeeper. He kept a careful distance, but he matched our pace too consistently to be mere coincidence. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Reginald's men. Likely. Edmund believes we should leave before first light, ahead of the other travelers staying here tonight, and take a different road than the one we originally planned. Nathaniel's expression was grim in the lamplight. It will add another half-day to our journey, but it may also lose whoever is following us. Then we do as he suggests, Eleanor said. I did not come this far to be stopped a day's ride from Ashworth Fell. They left the inn well before dawn, the horse's breath visible in the cold morning air, and took a rougher road that wound through hills and narrow valleys Eleanor had never traveled before. The detour cost them time but seemed, by the second day, to have succeeded in its purpose, no rider or carriage reappearing behind them, as the landscape grew steadily bleaker and more remote, the gentle farmland of the south giving way to the wide, wind-swept openness of the moors. Eleanor watched the changing scenery with a mixture of dread and fragile hope, aware that somewhere ahead, in a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as anything she had ever seen, the man she loved might finally be waiting to be found. She thought of the portrait still carefully wrapped and stowed beneath her seat, the last piece of evidence connecting the life she had built in his absence to the truth of what had actually happened to him, and she found herself hoping, with an intensity that surprised her, that when she finally saw his face again, some part of the man she had painted 6 years earlier would still remain. We are close now, Nathaniel said, consulting his map as the carriage crested a low rise, and the wind picked up sharply outside the windows. Ashworth Fell should lie just beyond that ridge. Eleanor drew her shawl tighter and fixed her eyes on the horizon, where gray clouds gathered low over the distant hills, and prepared herself, as best she could, for whatever truth waited on the other side of them. A gunshot cracked across the moor, and Eleanor threw herself flat against the carriage seat before she understood what had happened, her ears ringing as Edmund shouted something urgent from the driver's box, and the horses lurched into a sudden, jarring run. "Stay down," Nathaniel said, his arm braced across her shoulders, his own body angled toward the window in an attempt to see who had fired and from where. The carriage careened along the narrow moorland road. wheels striking ruts hard enough to jolt Eleanor's teeth together, and for several long minutes she could do nothing but grip the seat and pray the wheels held. When the shouting outside finally faded and Edmund slowed the horses to a shaking trot, Nathaniel eased the window curtain aside just enough to look behind them. "Gone," he said, though his voice carried little relief. "A warning shot, I think, rather than an attempt to hit us. Someone wanted us to know we had been seen." Eleanor straightened slowly, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirts, more from shock than any real effort to compose herself. "Then they know we are close to Ashworth Fell." "They likely knew before we did," Nathaniel said grimly. "Margaret warned us Reginald's men watched the roads north. I underestimated how closely." Edmund brought the carriage to a full stop a short distance later, in the shelter of a low stone wall bordering a stretch of open moor, and climbed down to check the horses with hands that were not entirely steady despite his evident experience with hard roads. "We cannot continue on the main road," he said, once Nathaniel had joined him outside. "Not if they are watching for us. There is a shepherd's track a mile east that will bring us near Ashworth Fell from the far side, longer, but less likely to be watched." "Do you know it well enough to manage it after dark?" Nathaniel asked. "Well enough," Edmund said, "though I would rather not test my knowledge against a moor at midnight if it can be helped." They pressed on cautiously, taking the shepherd's track as the light began to fail, the wide emptiness of the moor turning steadily more forbidding as evening deepened into night around them. Eleanor sat pressed close to the window despite the cold, watching the darkening landscape for any sign of movement, her mind circling endlessly around the gunshot and what it meant for whoever waited for them at the almshouse.
"He will hear of this,"
she said quietly, as much to herself as to Nathaniel. "Reginald, he will know we are coming before we arrive." "Likely," Nathaniel agreed, "which means whoever guards Alaric will be watching for us as well. We cannot simply walk up to the door and ask to be let in. Then what do we do?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled in the dim light of the carriage lamp. "I do not know yet. I had hoped we might arrive quietly, speak with whoever oversees the property, perhaps find sympathy the way we found it in Margaret. But a gunshot on the road suggests we will not be greeted with quite that much patience." They reached a small, isolated inn near the edge of Ashworth Fell village well past midnight, a low stone building with only a single lamp still burning in its front window. The innkeeper, a taciturn woman with sharp eyes not unlike Margaret's, asked no questions as she showed them to two small rooms, though Eleanor noticed her gaze linger a moment too long on Nathaniel's satchel before she withdrew. "We should not trust her either," Eleanor murmured once the door was closed. "Not entirely." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "I do not think we can trust anyone fully until we know precisely who in this village answers to Reginald and who does not." Sleep came slowly and thinly that night, and Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of Nathaniel already moving about in the next room, his low voice carrying through the thin wall as he spoke with someone she did not recognize. When she joined him, she found a boy of perhaps 14 standing near the door, cap twisted nervously in his hands, clearly uneasy at being summoned so early. "This is Tobias," Nathaniel said. "His family keeps sheep on the fell nearest the old almshouse." I asked the innkeeper, carefully, if anyone local knew the property, and she pointed me toward his father, who was reluctant to speak but sent the boy instead. Tobias glanced between them before speaking, his accent thick with the Moor's flat, careful vowels. "The old almshouse has not truly been an almshouse in my lifetime. My father says a gentleman bought it near on 7 years back, had it fitted up proper inside, though the outside were left to look near abandoned. There's always men about the gate, 2 or 3, and none of them from these parts. We're told to keep our sheep well clear and ask no questions, and my father is paid well enough not to mind the asking." "Have you ever seen anyone inside?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "A man, perhaps unwell, or kept close to the house?" Tobias hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door, as though he feared being overheard even here. "Once, maybe 18 months back, I strayed too close chasing a stray ewe, and saw a man at an upper window. Thin he was, and marked bad on one side of his face, like he'd been burned. He looked down at me for a long moment before one of the guards pulled him back from the glass. I never told my father exactly what I saw, didn't think he'd believe it worth the trouble it might bring." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, the description landing in her chest like a physical blow. A man marked by fire kept behind guarded windows, watching a boy on the moor with what she could only imagine was desperate, silent longing for anything beyond his confinement. "Thank you, Tobias," Nathaniel said gently, pressing a coin into the boy's hand despite his evident hesitation to take it. "You have helped us more than you know." Please, say nothing of this conversation to anyone." Once the boy had gone, Eleanor turned to Nathaniel with fresh resolve hardening beneath her fear. "We know now that he is there, that he is alive, and that he has been watched closely enough that even a shepherd's boy dares not speak of it openly. We cannot wait for a safer moment, Mr. Cole. Every day we delay is another day he believes himself forgotten." "I agree," Nathaniel said. "But we cannot simply walk to the gate either. Not with guards posted and orders already given, likely, to turn away or worse anyone who comes asking after him." He paced the small room, thinking aloud. "We need a reason to approach that guards would not think to question. A delivery perhaps, or some errand ordinary enough not to raise suspicion." "The innkeeper," Eleanor said slowly. "If the guards are supplied from the village, someone must carry provisions to the house regularly. If we could learn who, and offer to accompany them, even once." "It is worth trying," Nathaniel agreed, "though it will mean trusting the innkeeper with at least part of the truth." They found the innkeeper in her kitchen an hour later, and though her expression remained carefully unreadable throughout Nathaniel's careful, partial explanation, something in her manner shifted once Eleanor added, quietly, that the man they sought had once been kind to her, and that 6 years of silence had already cost them more than either of them could easily bear. "I have wondered, more than once, what truly happens behind that gate," the innkeeper admitted finally. "My nephew carries provisions up twice a week, paid well to keep his mouth shut about whatever he sees. I cannot promise he will risk his position to help you. But I will ask him, if you are willing to wait until his next delivery." "When is that?" Eleanor asked. "Tomorrow morning," the innkeeper said. "If you are patient enough to wait one more day, Miss Ashcombe, I believe I can arrange for you to see, with your own eyes, whether the man you seek is truly there." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. One more day feeling like both an eternity and a mercy after 6 years of far longer waiting. "Then we will wait," she said. "One more day, and then no more." That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Eleanor sat by the small window of her room and watched the dark shape of the distant fell against the star-scattered sky, imagining, with an ache that had not dulled in 6 years, the man somewhere beyond it who might, tomorrow, finally know that he had never truly been forgotten. A soft knock came at her door well past midnight, and she opened it to find Nathaniel standing in the corridor, a candle in one hand and his expression troubled in its flickering light. "I could not sleep either," he admitted, before she could ask. "I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow, while there is still time to change our plan if you wish it." She stepped back to let him in, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the night chill. "What troubles you?" "The innkeeper's nephew may refuse us outright, once he understands what we are truly asking of him," Nathaniel said. "And if he agrees but is discovered, the consequences may fall on him as much as on us. I do not wish to place a boy's safety at risk for the sake of our own purposes, however just those purposes may be." Eleanor considered this carefully, understanding the weight of what he was truly asking her. "You wish to know whether I would forgive myself, if harm came to him because of what we ask." "I wish to know whether we are certain enough of our cause to accept that risk," Nathaniel said. "I believe we are close to the truth, Miss Ashcombe, but closeness is not certainty, and I would rather ask the question now than regret not asking it later. I have thought of little else these past 6 years, but what I might have done differently, had I known the truth sooner," Eleanor said quietly. "I cannot promise you certainty, Mr. Cole. I can only tell you that I am prepared to accept the risk myself, and that I will make certain the nephew understands exactly what he agrees to before he agrees to it, so the choice remains his own, and not one we have forced upon him." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like admiration settling into his tired features. "Then we proceed as planned, and we make certain he chooses freely." He left shortly after, and Eleanor finally allowed herself a few hours of restless sleep, waking before dawn to the sound of activity already stirring in the inn below. She dressed quickly and found Nathaniel already in the kitchen, speaking quietly with a young man of perhaps 20 who bore the innkeeper's same sharp, watchful eyes. "This is my nephew, Peter," the innkeeper said, her hand resting protectively on the young man's shoulder. "I have told him what you asked, and left the choice to him." Peter looked between them with visible nervousness, though his jaw was set with a determination that reminded Eleanor, briefly and painfully, of the same stubbornness she had once loved in Alaric's own face. "I have carried provisions to that house for near 2 years now," he said. "I never asked what happened behind its walls, because I was told plainly not to, and because the pay was good enough to make the not asking easy. But I have seen enough, in glimpses, to guess it is nothing good. If you are asking me to help you learn the truth of it, I will not refuse." You understand the risk, Nathaniel said carefully. If the guards suspect you of bringing strangers close to the house, your position, and perhaps your safety, may be forfeit. I understand it, Peter said, but I have carried my silence like a stone in my pocket for 2 years now, and I find I am tired of the weight of it. Better to risk something for the truth than to keep carrying a burden I never chose in the first place. Eleanor felt her throat tighten at the young man's quiet courage, so freely offered to strangers who had appeared in his aunt's kitchen only the night before. Thank you, Peter, truly. We will not forget what you risk for us. They agreed on a plan carefully, in low voices around the kitchen table as the sky outside slowly lightened toward morning. Peter would make his usual delivery as expected, drawing no suspicion, but would arrange to leave the gate slightly ajar on his return, giving Eleanor and Nathaniel a narrow window in which to approach unseen while the guards' attention remained fixed on the delivery itself. It was not a perfect plan, and all three of them knew it, but it was the only opening available to them, and Eleanor found she could not bear to wait for a better one. As the first gray light of morning touched the edges of the moor, Eleanor stood at the window of her room one final time, watching Peter's cart trundle away up the narrow track toward the distant guarded house, carrying with it not just provisions but the fragile hope of 6 long years finally being answered. She pressed a hand against the cold glass, steadying her breath, and turned to find Nathaniel waiting quietly in the doorway, his own expression a careful mixture of resolve and worry. Whatever we find beyond that gate, he said, I want you to know I do not regret bringing that painting to your door, Miss Ashcombe. Whatever comes next, I believe you deserve the chance to learn the truth, even if the truth proves difficult to bear. Thank you, Mr. Cole, Eleanor said softly. For that, and for everything since. She drew a steadying breath, fixing her eyes on the distant shape of the almshouse rising faintly against the gray morning sky. Now let us go and finally learn what 6 years of silence have truly cost us both. The gate stood open only a hand's width, exactly as Peter had promised, and Eleanor's heart hammered so hard against her ribs she feared the guards might hear it from across the courtyard. Nathaniel gripped her arm briefly, a silent signal to wait, his eyes fixed on the 2 men lounging near the delivery cart, their attention fully absorbed in counting the sacks of grain Peter unloaded with careful, unhurried movements. Now, Nathaniel breathed, and they slipped through the narrow gap in the gate together, keeping low against the shadow of the stone wall, moving as quickly and silently as Eleanor's trembling legs would allow. The house rose before them, gray and weathered, its windows narrow and mostly shuttered, giving it the appearance of a building that had long ago given up any pretense of welcome. Nathaniel led her around the side, away from the courtyard and the guard's line of sight, toward a smaller door that Peter had mentioned led to the kitchens and was often left unlatched during the delivery hour. The door gave easily beneath Nathaniel's hand, and they slipped inside to a narrow, dim corridor, smelling faintly of old stone and wood smoke. Eleanor's breath came in short, shallow bursts, every instinct screaming at her to call out, to search every room at once, though she forced herself to move carefully, quietly, following Nathaniel's lead through the unfamiliar house. They found a narrow staircase near the back of the corridor, and Eleanor's mind flashed unbidden to Tobias's description of an upper window, a thin man marked by fire looking down at a boy on the moor. She started up the stairs before Nathaniel could stop her, driven by an urgency she could no longer temper with caution. Eleanor, he hissed, following close behind, carefully. At the top of the stairs, a single door stood at the end of a short landing, its lock heavy and new against the otherwise aged wood of the house. Eleanor's hand found the handle before her mind had fully decided to move, and she found it unlocked, swinging open beneath her touch to reveal a small, sparsely furnished room, lit by a single narrow window. A man sat near that window, thin, his shoulders hunched in the manner of someone who had spent long years expecting very little from the world around him. He turned at the sound of the door, and Eleanor's breath left her entirely. It was him, older than the portrait she had painted, his face marked along one side by the pale, uneven scarring of an old burn, his once thick dark hair thinned and touched with premature gray. But it was him, unmistakably, the same eyes that had watched her paint 6 years ago now widening with a shock so profound he seemed for a moment unable to speak at all. Eleanor, he said finally, his voice rough with disuse, as though the name itself were something he had not allowed himself to say aloud in a very long time. This cannot be real. It is, she said, crossing the small room in 3 unsteady steps and kneeling before his chair, taking his hands in hers with a tenderness that had waited 6 long years to be offered again. I am here, Alaric. I am truly here. He stared at her as though she might dissolve at any moment, his fingers tightening around hers with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "They told me you had married. Years ago, not long after the fire. They told me you had moved on entirely, that you never once asked after me, that you believed the notice of my death and grieved briefly before continuing with your life as though I had never been part of it." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, grief and fury tangled together so tightly she could barely separate them. That was a lie, every word of it a lie, told to keep you from hoping, from resisting, from believing there was anyone left in the world who might come looking for you. I mourned you for 6 years, Alaric. I built my entire life around missing you. His composure cracked entirely then, and he pulled her closer, pressing his scarred face against her hair as something between a sob and a broken laugh shook through him. "I convinced myself some days that believing you had forgotten me was easier than hoping you might still care and being wrong. I am sorry. I am so sorry I let myself believe it." "You have nothing to apologize for," Eleanor said fiercely, pulling back just enough to look at him properly, to trace the changes 6 years of captivity had carved into his familiar face. "None of this was your doing. It was Reginald's, and whoever helped him carry it out." Behind them, Nathaniel cleared his throat gently, his own expression carefully composed despite the evident emotion of the moment. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but we do not have long before the guards notice the delivery has finished and return to their usual posts. We need to move quickly if we intend to leave this house today." Alaric's eyes moved to Nathaniel with visible confusion, the practical urgency of the moment slowly cutting through his shock. "Who are you?" "Nathaniel Cole, a clerk, employed by the solicitors handling your family's estate. I found Miss Ashcombe's portrait of you hidden in a locked room of your London townhouse, and it led us here." Nathaniel moved to the window, glancing carefully down at the courtyard below. The guards are still occupied with Peter's delivery, but not for much longer. Alaric rose unsteadily from his chair, years of confinement evident in the careful, uncertain way he tested his legs. "Even if we leave this room, the gate is watched constantly, and I have not attempted an escape in years. Not since the last attempt cost me privileges I only recently regained. I do not know if I have the strength for what you are asking." "You are not attempting this alone," Eleanor said, taking his arm to steady him. "We came prepared to help you leave, Alaric, not merely to find you and leave you here." He looked at her for a long moment, something rekindling behind the exhaustion in his eyes, a flicker of the stubborn determination she remembered so well from the man who had once promised her the whole world would eventually know the truth of their love. "Then let us not waste the chance you have given me." They moved carefully back down the narrow staircase, Alaric's steps slow but steadying with each passing moment, his hand gripping Eleanor's arm, as though he feared she might vanish if he released her entirely. At the bottom of the stairs, Nathaniel paused at the corner of the corridor, peering carefully around toward the kitchen door through which they had entered. "Clear," he whispered, "but we will need to move quickly across the yard to reach the gate before the guards return to their positions." They slipped out into the pale morning light, the courtyard mercifully empty as Peter's cart rattled away up the track, its departure covering the sound of their own hurried footsteps. Eleanor kept close to Alaric's side, her heart pounding with every step, certain at any moment they would hear a shout of discovery behind them. They nearly made it. They were within 20 paces of the gate when a voice rang out sharply across the courtyard, one of the guards emerging from the stables with a look of confused alarm, quickly hardening into suspicion as he took in the sight of 3 figures moving urgently toward the exit. "Stop there," the guard called, already reaching for something at his belt. "Who are you? How did you get in?" "Run," Nathaniel said sharply, and they abandoned any pretense of quiet, sprinting the remaining distance to the gate as the guard's shout brought a second man rushing from somewhere behind the house. Alaric stumbled once, his legs unused to such sudden exertion after years of confinement, but Eleanor caught his arm and half-dragged him the final steps, through the gate and out onto the open track where Edmund waited with the carriage exactly where they had arranged. "In, quickly," Edmund urged, already gathering the reins as they scrambled aboard, and the carriage lurched into motion just as the first guard reached the gate behind them, shouting something Eleanor could not make out over the sudden pounding of hooves and wheels against packed earth. Alaric sat pressed between them, breathing hard, his hands still gripping Eleanor's with a tightness that spoke of a man who could not quite believe his freedom was real. "They will send riders after us," he said, once he had recovered enough breath to speak. "Reginald will not simply let this rest. He has too much to lose if the truth of what he has done becomes known." "Then we will not give him the chance to catch us," Nathaniel said grimly, glancing back through the small rear window as the almshouse receded behind them. "Edmund knows roads that will not be easy for anyone to follow, particularly not men unfamiliar with this country." Eleanor turned to look at Alaric properly, now that the immediate danger had eased slightly, taking in every detail of his face she had spent 6 years believing she would never see again. "I painted you 100 times in my memory these past 6 years," she said softly. "I never once imagined I would see you like this, thin and scarred and frightened, and yet somehow still exactly the man I remember." "I am not entirely that man any longer," Alaric admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of everything 6 years had cost him. "I have spent so long being told what to believe, what to feel, who still cared for me and who did not, that I am not certain I fully trust my own memories anymore. But I trust this." He lifted her hand gently, pressing it against his chest, where his heart beat rapid and unmistakably alive beneath her palm. "I trust that you are truly here, and that whatever else 6 years have taken from me, they did not take this." Eleanor felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks. 6 years of carefully controlled grief breaking loose all at once in the small, rattling carriage carrying them away from the place that had stolen so much time from them both. "We still have a great deal to face," she said, even as she allowed herself, finally, the simple relief of his hand in hers. "Reginald will not stop searching for us, not while you remain alive to expose everything he has done." "Then we will face it together," Alaric said, "as we should have been permitted to face everything 6 years ago." He looked past her, toward Nathaniel, who sat watching the road behind them with careful, unwavering attention. "And I owe you a debt, Mr. Cole, that I do not know how I will ever properly repay." "Seeing this moment is repayment enough," Nathaniel said quietly, though his eyes remained fixed on the empty road behind them, watching for any sign of pursuit that might yet turn their fragile victory into disaster before they reached safety. They traveled through the remainder of the day without stopping, Edmund guiding the horses along tracks so narrow and rough that Eleanor wondered more than once whether the carriage would survive the journey intact. Alaric slept for portions of it, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline of their escape, his head resting against Eleanor's shoulder in a way that felt both achingly familiar and entirely new, 6 years having reshaped even the simplest gestures of affection between them into something more fragile, more consciously treasured. When he woke, as the light began to fade toward evening, he seemed momentarily disoriented, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar carriage with a flicker of the same wariness Eleanor imagined had kept him alive through 6 years of captivity. "You are safe," she said gently, before panic could fully take hold of him. "We are well clear of Ashworth Fell. No one is following us, not that Nathaniel has seen." Alaric exhaled slowly, visibly working to steady himself. "Forgive me. I have woken like that more times than I can count these past years, uncertain for a moment whether, wherever I found myself was truly safety, or simply another room I had not yet learned the shape of." "There is nothing to forgive," Eleanor said, "but I would like to understand, if you are willing to speak of it, what those 6 years were truly like. I do not ask to cause you pain. I ask because I do not want any part of what happened to you to remain something you must carry alone." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, watching the darkening countryside pass beyond the window before he finally spoke. "The fire itself I remember only in fragments. Smoke and heat and Reginald's voice somewhere nearby, though I could not tell you now whether he spoke to me directly or simply to the men helping to carry me from the building. I woke days later in a room I did not recognize. My face and shoulder burned badly enough that I barely recognized myself in a glass they eventually allowed me. I was told, gently at first and then with increasing firmness, that it was safer for everyone, myself included, if the world continued believing me dead." "Safer how?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already understood the shape of the answer. "Safer for Reginald," Alaric said, a bitterness creeping into his voice that spoke of years spent swallowing the same anger. I did not understand the full extent of it until much later, pieced together from careless comments and half-overheard conversations between my guards. He had been managing our family's finances poorly for years before the fire, hiding losses, redirecting funds meant for tenant repairs and estate upkeep into ventures of his own that failed one after another. My death, or at least the appearance of it, solved several problems for him at once. He inherited the title and the means to continue his mismanagement without my oversight, and he avoided whatever consequences might have followed if I had lived to discover the truth of what he had done. Then why not simply let you die in the fire if your survival was such an inconvenience to him? Nathaniel asked, his notebook forgotten in his lap as he listened closely. I have wondered that myself, more nights than I can count, Alaric admitted. I believe, in the end, he could not quite bring himself to finish what the fire had started. Whatever else Reginald has become, he was my playmate once, before ambition and debt hardened whatever affection he once held for me. I think keeping me alive, hidden and controlled, was the compromise his conscience could bear, even as his actions grew crueler with each passing year to keep me compliant and silent. Eleanor tightened her hold on his hand, aching at the thought of 6 years spent as a bargaining chip in his own cousin's guilt. And the letters, the payments Margaret told us of. I was permitted to write, rarely, and only under close supervision, letters that were never sent as I intended them, I now understand, but used instead to maintain whatever arrangement Reginald had built to keep me quiet and manageable. I was told my compliance ensured better conditions, more freedom within the house, occasional books, better food. I was told resistance would ensure the opposite. I do not think I fully understood, until this very day, how thoroughly I had been shaped into believing survival required my own silence. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his earlier restraint giving way to something closer to quiet anger. That is not merely cruelty, Your Grace. That is a calculated system of control, built and maintained over years. It will not be difficult to prove, once the proper authorities examine the evidence we have already gathered. Proof will matter little if Reginald reaches us before we reach anyone capable of acting on it, Alaric said grimly. He has resources, connections, and 6 years of practice at managing exactly this kind of threat to his position. We should not underestimate how far he will go to protect what he has built at my expense. Eleanor felt the fragile warmth of their reunion tighten into something harder, more determined, as the reality of what still lay ahead of them settled fully into place. Then we do not give him the chance to reach us first. We gather everything Nathaniel has found, everything Margaret and Pemberton have told us, and we bring it to whoever can act on it swiftly enough to matter. The magistrates in London will need convincing, Nathaniel said thoughtfully. A title and a title's worth of influence do not simply bow to accusation, however well supported. We will need Alaric's own testimony, and likely Margaret's and Pemberton's as well, all given together, before any court will move quickly enough to matter. Alaric straightened slightly, something of his old bearing returning despite the exhaustion still evident in every line of his thin frame. Then let us go and give it. I have spent 6 years being told my voice mattered less than my silence. I find I am finished agreeing with that arrangement. As the carriage rattled on through the deepening dusk, carrying them steadily away from the moor and back toward the reckoning that still awaited them in London, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in 6 long years, to imagine a future that did not depend entirely on grief to give it shape. It would not come easily, she understood that clearly now. But for the first time since Nathaniel had appeared at her door with a portrait she had believed lost forever, she let herself believe that future might, after everything, still be possible. The door of Pemberton's office burst open before any of them had finished settling into their chairs, and Reginald Hawthorne strode in with a fury so barely contained that Eleanor felt Alaric stiffen beside her, his hand tightening around hers with an instinct that spoke of old, deeply rooted fear. "I thought I might find you here," Reginald said, his eyes moving across the room, cataloging each of them with the cold precision Eleanor remembered from their few brief encounters years before. "Cousin, you look remarkably well, for a dead man." "No thanks to you," Alaric said, his voice steadier than Eleanor had expected, though she could feel the tension radiating through the hand still gripping hers. Reginald's gaze shifted to Pemberton, who sat behind his desk with a carefully composed expression that did not fully mask his own unease. "I had hoped, Pemberton, that your loyalty to this family extended further than a single letter and a moment of misplaced conscience." "My loyalty was always to the family, Lord Hawthorne," Pemberton said evenly. "It simply took me too long to understand that your cousin was as much a part of that family as you, and deserving of far better than what you arranged for him." Reginald's composure cracked slightly, a flush of anger rising along his jaw. "You understand nothing of what I arranged, or why. I inherited an estate drowning in debts none of you ever troubled yourselves to notice, obligations I alone was left to manage, while everyone else enjoyed the comfortable fiction that Hawthorne wealth was inexhaustible. You could have told me the truth," Alaric said. "We could have found a solution together, as families should. Instead, you chose to burn me out of my own life and keep me as a prisoner for 6 years. I chose survival," Reginald snapped. "For myself, and in truth, for you as well, though I do not expect gratitude for it. Had the full extent of my mismanagement come to light while you still held the title, the scandal would have ruined us both entirely, stripped everything from the family name that generations before us built. I gave myself time to correct what I could. I gave you safety, however imperfect, rather than the alternative I might easily have chosen instead. You gave me 6 years of believing myself abandoned by everyone who claimed to love me," Alaric said, his voice rising now with an anger Eleanor had not yet seen from him. 6 years of carefully suppressed fury finally finding its release. You gave me letters I never wrote, sent to no one, and told me my continued safety depended on my silence and my compliance. That was not mercy, Reginald. That was cruelty dressed carefully enough to let you sleep at night. The room fell into a heavy, charged silence, broken only by the ticking of Pemberton's clock and the sound of Reginald's ragged breathing, as he struggled visibly to master his own composure. Eleanor watched him closely, searching for any sign of the man Alaric had once described as a childhood playmate, someone whose affection had curdled slowly into ambition and fear rather than cruelty from the start. She found only a man cornered by consequences 6 years in the making, calculating even now, she suspected, whatever path remained open to him. What do you intend to do? Reginald asked finally, his voice quieter but no less dangerous. Drag our family's name through every courtroom and newspaper in London? Destroy what remains of the Hawthorne reputation entirely, for the sake of settling old grievances? I intend to reclaim my life, Alaric said, and to see that the truth of what you did is fully known, whatever cost that carries for either of us. You do not get to decide, once again, what price I am willing to pay for the truth. Reginald's eyes flicked toward the door, and something in his expression shifted, a calculation Eleanor recognized a fraction of a second too late to give proper warning. He moved suddenly toward the desk, reaching for something Eleanor could not immediately identify, and Nathaniel lunged forward at the same moment, catching Reginald's arm before he could complete whatever action he intended. Enough, Nathaniel said sharply, wresting a small pistol from Reginald's grip with more strength than his slight frame suggested he possessed, tossing it clattering across the floor well out of easy reach. This ends now, Lord Hawthorne, not with more violence. Reginald stood frozen for a long moment, breathing hard, the full weight of his exposed desperation settling visibly over his features. Whatever composure he had carried into the room had fully abandoned him now, leaving only a man who understood, at last, that 6 years of carefully managed control had finally slipped entirely beyond his grasp. You do not understand what you are undoing, he said, his voice hoarse. The debts I concealed will destroy what remains of this family, regardless of what happens to me personally. Tenants will lose their homes. Servants who have depended on Hawthorne wages for generations will find themselves without positions. You wish to see justice done, cousin, but justice rarely arrives without collateral cost to those least responsible for causing it. Then we will address those debts honestly, as they should have been addressed from the beginning, Alaric said. Rather than concealed beneath 6 years of lies and a stolen life, I would rather rebuild this family's fortune slowly and honestly, than continue benefiting from whatever foundation of cruelty you have built it upon since the fire. Pemberton rose from behind his desk, moving carefully toward the door. I have already sent word to the magistrates, in anticipation of exactly this confrontation. They should arrive within the hour, along with representatives prepared to review the estate's true financial state. He met Reginald's eyes steadily. I am sorry it has come to this, Lord Hawthorne. I truly am. But I could not continue my own silence any longer, not once I understood the full weight of what it had cost. Reginald sank slowly into a chair, the fight visibly draining out of him, as the reality of his situation settled fully into place. You will have your justice then, he said bitterly. Though I doubt it will feel as satisfying as you imagine, once the full cost of unraveling 6 years of careful arrangement becomes clear to everyone involved. Perhaps not, Alaric said quietly, but I would rather face an honest reckoning than continue living inside a lie built for your comfort at my expense. The magistrates arrived precisely as Pemberton had promised, accompanied by 2 officials from the court, prepared to examine the estate's tangled finances alongside the evidence Nathaniel had carefully gathered over the preceding days. Margaret arrived as well, summoned by a message Pemberton had sent that morning, her testimony offered with a steadiness that surprised even Eleanor. 6 years of carefully guarded silence finally given voice in service of the truth. The proceedings that followed stretched across several tense hours, questions and evidence laid out methodically before officials, whose expressions grew steadily grimmer as the full shape of Reginald's deception emerged. Eleanor sat beside Alaric throughout, her hand rarely leaving his, watching the careful, patient work of justice slowly disassemble 6 years of lies, one document, one testimony, one piece of evidence at a time. By evening, Reginald had been formally taken into custody, the full weight of his crimes, financial fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and deliberate deception spanning 6 years, laid out clearly enough that even his own solicitor, summoned belatedly to advise him, offered little argument against the charges. Eleanor watched him led away with a complicated mixture of relief and something almost like pity, understanding, even now, that ambition curdled by fear had cost this man everything, as surely as it had cost Alaric 6 years of his own life. "It is over," Alaric said quietly, once the room had finally emptied enough to allow a moment of stillness between them. "I confess, I do not entirely know how to feel, now that it has actually happened." "You do not need to know yet," Eleanor said gently. "You have spent 6 years surviving one single unbearable circumstance. You are allowed time to simply feel whatever comes, without needing it to make immediate sense." He turned to face her fully, some of the old warmth she remembered so well finally returning to his tired eyes. "I do know one thing clearly enough. I do not wish to spend whatever years remain to me the way I spent the last 6, cautious and silent, and afraid to hope for anything beyond mere survival." He lifted her hand gently, pressing it to his lips in a gesture so achingly familiar it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I loved you before the fire took 6 years from us both, Eleanor. I have never once stopped, not through every day of captivity, not through every lie I was told about your own feelings toward me. I do not intend to waste another single day pretending otherwise." Eleanor felt something settle fully into place within her chest. 6 years of carefully managed grief, finally giving way to something she had almost forgotten how to feel freely. "Then let us not waste it," she said softly. "Let us build whatever comes next honestly, together, exactly as we always intended before everything was taken from us." Outside Pemberton's window, the evening light had turned soft and golden over the London rooftops, and as Alaric drew her gently into his arms, Eleanor allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe that the life she had mourned for 6 long years might yet be reclaimed, not as it once was, but as something new, built honestly from the wreckage of everything that had tried to keep them apart. The weeks that followed brought a different kind of difficulty, quieter than the danger of the moor but no less demanding. Alaric's return from presumed death required careful handling, first among the family's remaining connections, then before the wider circles of society that had spent 6 years believing his story concluded. Pemberton guided much of this process with a diligence that seemed, to Eleanor's eye, at least partly an attempt to atone for his years of silence, drafting statements, arranging meetings with officials, and quietly managing the estate's tangled finances towards something resembling order. Eleanor found herself present for a great deal of it, though she remained watchful of overstepping a place society had not yet decided how to grant her. She had, after all, returned into Alaric's life not as a duchess or even a formally acknowledged intended, but as the low-born painter whose attachment to him his own family had once worked so hard to prevent. She said as much to him one evening, as they sat together in the modest townhouse he had taken temporarily while the larger estate matters resolved themselves. "I do not care what society decides to call our attachment," Alaric said, when she raised the concern aloud. "I spent 6 years being told what to believe about you, about myself, about everything I once thought certain. I find I have very little patience left for allowing anyone else to dictate the shape of what remains of my life." "It is easier to say that in private," Eleanor said gently, "than to live it once the full weight of public opinion turns its attention toward us." "Then let it turn," he said, taking her hand across the small table between them. "I would rather face scrutiny honestly, at your side, than spend one more day pretending my feelings for you were ever anything less than they truly are." Margaret visited them not long after. Her earlier caution finally softened into something like ease, now that Reginald's threat no longer hung over her daily life. She brought with her, at Eleanor's gentle urging, a fuller account of the small kindnesses she had managed to offer Alaric during his captivity, extra blankets in the coldest months, books smuggled in against explicit instruction, small mercies that had done little to ease his confinement but had, she confessed through tears, been the only defiance she had found the courage to offer. "You did more than you believe," Alaric told her, taking her hands in both of his. "There were nights I survived only because I told myself someone, somewhere in that house, still saw me as a person, rather than merely a problem to be managed. I did not know it was you specifically, not until Eleanor told me. But I felt it, Margaret. I promise you, I felt it." Nathaniel remained a frequent presence as well, though his role shifted gradually from investigator to something closer to trusted friend, a position Eleanor suspected surprised him nearly as much as it pleased him. He had returned, in the weeks following Reginald's arrest, to his position at the solicitor's office, though his employer, made aware of the pivotal role he had played in uncovering the truth, had quietly arranged a substantial increase in both his salary and his responsibilities. You could have simply left that painting where you found it, Eleanor told him one afternoon, as they walked together through a small park near Alaric's townhouse. You could have said nothing at all, and none of us would have been the wiser. I have thought about that more than once, Nathaniel admitted. But I do not believe I could have lived comfortably with that silence, once I understood what it likely concealed. My father taught me that lesson at great cost to himself. I would rather honor what he tried to do, even imperfectly, than repeat his mistake of staying silent when speaking mattered most. Then I am glad, Eleanor said, that you chose to speak, whatever it cost you to find me, and whatever risk you carried in bringing that painting to my door. I do not believe either Alaric or I will ever be able to properly repay it. Seeing you both finally free of everything Reginald built around you is repayment enough, Nathaniel said, echoing the same words he had offered in the carriage weeks before, though this time spoken with the easy warmth of a friendship rather than the urgency of danger. Reginald's trial, when it finally came, proved as difficult as everyone had anticipated, drawing exactly the kind of public attention Eleanor had feared. Newspapers eager to detail every scandalous particular of a duke's 6-year imprisonment and his cousin's elaborate deception. Alaric bore the scrutiny with a steadiness that surprised even himself, testifying plainly and without embellishment before a courtroom crowded with spectators hungry for every detail of his ordeal. The verdict, when it arrived, offered little satisfaction beyond the simple fact of justice served. Reginald was stripped of whatever remained of his standing and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that would keep him confined for years to come, a strange, uncomfortable mirror of the confinement he had once arranged for his own cousin. Alaric watched the sentencing without visible triumph, only a quiet, tired relief that Eleanor recognized as the particular exhaustion of a burden finally set down after being carried too long. I thought I would feel more, he admitted afterward, as they walked slowly away from the courthouse together. Vindication, perhaps, or something closer to satisfaction. Instead, I feel mostly tired, and grateful it is finally finished. That is its own kind of relief, Eleanor said. You do not owe anyone, least of all yourself, a more dramatic reaction than the one you actually feel. They spent the following months rebuilding slowly, the estate's finances gradually restored to honest order under new management Pemberton helped arrange, Alaric's health and strength returning steadily with proper care and, more importantly, the simple freedom of days no longer governed by guards and locked doors. Eleanor continued her painting, though she found herself increasingly drawn to portraits again, this time signed openly with her own name, no longer hidden beneath the careful anonymity 6 years of grief had taught her to adopt. On a quiet afternoon in early autumn, nearly a year after Nathaniel had first appeared at her cottage door, Alaric asked her to marry him in the same small studio where their reunion had first been made possible, standing beside the very portrait that had brought them back together. There was no grand ceremony to the asking, only his familiar voice, steady now in a way it had not been in the carriage or the courtroom, and the quiet certainty of a promise finally spoken aloud without fear of consequence. I have loved you since long before the fire took 6 years from us both, he said. I do not intend to spend whatever years remain without you at my side, honestly and openly, exactly as we always should have been permitted. Eleanor, her hands still faintly stained with paint, said yes without a moment's hesitation. 6 years of stolen time, finally giving way to a future neither of them intended to let slip away again. A carriage arrived unannounced outside the Hawthorne country house on a cold morning nearly 2 years after the wedding, and Eleanor set down her brush the moment she recognized the crest painted faintly beneath a layer of travel dust on its door, her stomach tightening with an old, familiar wariness she had thought fully behind her. That is not one of ours, she said, moving quickly to find Alaric in his study. He joined her at the window, his expression darkening as he too recognized the crest. That belonged to my aunt, Reginald's mother. She has had little contact with this family since his conviction. I cannot imagine what brings her here now. The woman who stepped down from the carriage was thin and gray-haired, her once elegant bearing worn down by what Eleanor could only assume were 2 difficult years. She approached the house slowly, almost hesitantly, and when Alaric opened the door himself rather than waiting for a servant, her composure nearly broke entirely. I did not know if you would receive me, she said. After everything my son did to you, I would understand entirely if you turned me away. You are not your son, Aunt Constance, Alaric said, though his voice carried a careful reserve Eleanor recognized as the same wariness she herself still felt toward anyone connected to Reginald's schemes. Come in, tell us what has brought you here. They settled in the drawing room, and Constance accepted tea with hands that trembled slightly around the cup. I have come because I received a letter from Reginald, from prison, only a fortnight past. He wrote of something he claims he never fully disclosed during his trial, a second property, purchased under yet another false name, where he says certain documents remain hidden, documents he believes may implicate others who assisted him in concealing his crimes over the years. She hesitated. He says he wishes to make what amends remain possible to him, though I confess I do not know whether to trust the sincerity of a man who has lied so thoroughly for so long. Eleanor felt an old, uncomfortable tension return to her shoulders, the sense that 6 years of buried secrets might yet hold further surprises capable of disturbing the fragile peace they had built. "Do you believe him?" "I do not know," Constance admitted, "but I could not simply ignore the possibility that others who helped him remain free and unaccountable, while he alone bears the full weight of what was, in truth, a scheme that likely required more hands than his own to sustain for 6 years. Alaric exchanged a glance with Eleanor, the same careful calculation she remembered from the early days of their investigation settling over his features once more. "Then we should learn the truth of it, whatever it costs to uncover." Nathaniel arrived within the week, summoned by a letter Alaric had sent immediately after Constance's visit, his own life having settled comfortably into a partnership at the solicitor's firm where he had once worked merely as a clerk. He listened carefully to the full account of Reginald's claim, his old investigative instincts sharpening visibly as the details unfolded. "A second property is plausible," he said. "Reginald managed his deception across many years and many resources. It would not surprise me if further evidence remains uncovered, particularly evidence that might implicate others who profited alongside him, or helped maintain his arrangements without ever being formally connected to the crimes themselves." "Then we find it," Eleanor said, "before it can be destroyed or quietly disposed of by whoever else might have reason to fear its discovery." The property, once located through careful inquiry and a visit to Reginald himself in prison, a meeting Alaric endured with a composure that Eleanor knew cost him a great deal, proved to be a small house near Bristol, purchased years earlier under a name none of them recognized. Inside, hidden beneath loose floorboards in a locked study, they discovered a further collection of ledgers detailing payments made not only to guards and to Margaret, but to several other individuals whose involvement in Reginald's scheme had never been fully examined during the original trial. Among them was a name that struck Eleanor with particular force, a junior official within the very court that had overseen the initial, cursory investigation into the fire at Ashcombe Hall 6 years before, a man who had, it seemed, accepted payment to ensure that investigation concluded quickly and without troubling scrutiny. "This changes a great deal," Nathaniel said grimly, studying the ledger by lamplight. "If this official's corruption can be proven, it opens the possibility that other cases he handled during those years deserve similarly close examination. Reginald's scheme may have relied on a wider pattern of quiet corruption than any of us previously understood. The revelation set in motion a second, quieter reckoning over the following months, an inquiry conducted with far less public spectacle than Reginald's original trial, but no less consequential for those implicated. The corrupt official was removed from his position and faced charges of his own, and 2 other individuals named in the ledgers, minor functionaries who had accepted payment to look the other way at crucial moments, were similarly held to account. Through it all, Eleanor found herself grateful, in a way she had not fully anticipated, for the opportunity to see the fuller shape of justice finally completed, 6 years of buried corruption brought fully into the light, rather than left to fester unexamined beneath the surface of a single, contained scandal. Constance visited often during this period, her initial hesitant reserve gradually softening into something closer to genuine warmth, as she watched Alaric and Eleanor navigate the difficult work of uncovering truth without allowing it to reopen old wounds beyond healing. She spoke rarely of Reginald directly, though Eleanor noticed the quiet grief that crossed her face whenever his name arose, the particular sorrow of a mother forced to reconcile love for a son with clear-eyed understanding of the harm he had caused. "I do not ask you to forgive him," Constance said to Eleanor one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens Eleanor had begun slowly restoring to their former beauty. "I understand that forgiveness is not owed simply because I request it. I only hope that whatever peace you and Alaric have built together remains untouched by whatever further truths this new evidence brings to light." "It will not be untouched," Eleanor said honestly. "But I do not believe our peace depends on ignorance, Constance. I believe it depends on honesty, however difficult that honesty proves to uncover. We built our life back from 6 years of careful lies. I would rather face whatever remains of the truth than build our future on any further silence." By the following spring, the wider inquiry had largely concluded, the corrupt officials held properly accountable, and the last remaining shadows of Reginald's 6-year deception finally, fully dispelled. Alaric marked the occasion quietly, commissioning Eleanor to paint a new portrait, not of himself this time, but of the two of them together, seated in the same garden Eleanor had spent months restoring, the estate's old grandeur slowly returning around them in a manner that mirrored, Eleanor thought, their own slow, careful rebuilding. "I want this one displayed openly," Alaric said, as she began the first careful sketches. "Not hidden in a locked room, waiting years to be discovered. I want everyone who visits this house to see exactly what we built, honestly, after everything that tried to keep us apart." Eleanor smiled, mixing the first colors for what she already knew would be the finest work of her career. A portrait built not from stolen afternoons and forbidden longing, but from a love that had survived 6 years of lies and emerged, finally, into full and unguarded daylight. "Then let us make certain it is beautiful enough to deserve that place," she said, and began to paint. Nathaniel married within the year, a quiet, capable woman named Margaret Fenwick, no relation to the Margaret who had first helped guide them toward the truth, though Eleanor found the coincidence of the name pleasing all the same. He remained a close and trusted friend to them both for the remainder of his life, his old talent for uncovering hidden truths eventually earning him a reputation as one of London's most respected solicitors, a man known equally for his careful diligence and his quiet, unshakable insistence on honesty above easy comfort. Margaret O'Shea, too, remained a welcome presence in their lives, her earlier guilt over 6 years of accepted silence gradually easing into something closer to peace as she watched the truth she had finally helped uncover settle into lasting good rather than further harm. She often visited in the autumn, when the light in the garden turned particularly golden, and would sit for hours with Eleanor discussing everything and nothing, two women bound together by a shared history neither of them had chosen but both had ultimately helped to heal. As for Eleanor and Alaric, their years together unfolded not without difficulty. For 6 years of stolen time could not be entirely undone by any reckoning, however thorough. But they built, slowly and deliberately, exactly the honest life they had once been forbidden, filled with open affection, unguarded truth, and a portrait hanging proudly in their garden room that told anyone who looked upon it the whole of their story, hidden no longer, and never again to be locked away. There were quiet moments, in the years that followed, when the old fear still surfaced unexpectedly. Alaric sometimes woke in the deep hours of the night, momentarily uncertain of the room around him, his hand reaching instinctively for Eleanor, before his mind fully caught up with the truth of where he now lay. She learned to recognize those nights without needing to be told, and would simply hold him until his breathing steadied, until the shape of their bedroom and the sound of her own voice reminded him fully that the almshouse and its guarded gate belonged only to memory now. Eleanor, for her part, found that certain sounds could still unsettle her long after any real danger had passed, the sharp crack of a carriage wheel against stone, the particular creak of a heavy lock turning. Alaric never once made her feel foolish for these moments, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, how deeply 6 years of fear could root themselves into a person, resurfacing long after the circumstances that planted them had been resolved. Their daughter was born the following autumn, a bright-eyed girl they named Grace, and Eleanor found, watching Alaric hold their child for the first time, that some final, deeply buried piece of the grief she had carried for 6 years finally, fully released its hold on her. He wept openly, unashamed, cradling their daughter with the same careful tenderness Eleanor remembered from the first afternoon he had sat for his portrait so many years before, and she understood, watching him, that whatever the fire and Reginald's cruelty had tried to take from him, they had not managed to take this, his capacity for open, unguarded love, offered freely and without fear. Grace grew up hearing pieces of her parents' story slowly, in ways suited to her age, never as a single dramatic tale but as fragments offered honestly whenever her questions arose. She grew particularly fond of the garden portrait, often sitting before it as a child and asking her mother to describe, again and again, the exact moment Nathaniel had first knocked on the cottage door with a painting wrapped carefully in brown cloth. "Tell me again how you knew it was truly him," Grace would ask, though she had heard the answer countless times before. "I knew the brushwork," Eleanor always told her. "Before I ever saw his face clearly, I knew my own hand had painted that portrait, and I knew, in that same instant, that everything I believed about the last 6 years might not be entirely true." She would smile then, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Sometimes the truth arrives quietly, carried by a stranger at your door. You only have to be brave enough to let it in." And so their story settled, finally, into the steady, ordinary rhythm of a life honestly lived, 6 years of stolen time transformed, slowly and deliberately, into decades of the truth they had always deserved.